Snow fell the way it does in postcard towns, slow, soft, almost polite, settling on garlands and string lights like it was trying not to disturb the music. The holiday event had taken over the main street. Cocoa stands breathing out chocolate steam, a choir under a gazebo, kids with red cheeks chasing each other between twinkling wreaths, and a line of families waiting to take photos beside a painted sleigh. In the middle of it all stood a decorated police K9. His harness trimmed with a simple festive ribbon the department's receptionist had insisted on tying for community spirit. And beside him, a veteran handler who looked like he'd learned long ago not to waste motion. The dog's name tag glinted under the lights, and he sat with that calm, coiled patience that made people feel safe without ever letting them forget he was working. Most folks approached the way you approach a sleeping storm. Careful, respectful, smiling too wide as if smiles could earn permission. But the little girl didn't smile. She moved through the crowd like a shadow that had learned to be small. Hood pulled up, hands tucked into sleeves, eyes flicking from face to face, as if she was counting exits instead of candy canes. When she reached the dog, she didn't ask to pet him. She didn't squeal. She simply dropped to her knees in the slush, close enough that the handler's posture shifted, subtle, protective, and she leaned in until her mouth was near the dog's ear. The handler started to speak, gentle but firm, the way you talk to a child near a working animal. But the sound died in his throat as the dog's entire body changed. Not tense like fear, not excited like play. Still, pure stillness, the kind that made the air feel heavier. The dog's ears angled forward as if the girl had flipped a switch inside him, and his eyes narrowed to a point beyond the Christmas lights. The little girl whispered again, fast and quiet, her breath puffing white against his fur. The handler caught fragments. "Behind? Door? Now," they said. And then the girl's eyes flicked up to his, glossy with a terror that didn't belong at a holiday festival. "Please," she breathed, so small it almost vanished under the choir's song. The handler's hand moved to the dog's harness, not tugging, just anchoring. And the dog, no longer a mascot for photos, no longer a friendly symbol, snapped his head toward a building across the street. An old brick structure with a cheerful banner that read, "Winter Donation Drive," the kind of place nobody questioned because it sounded like kindness. The dog's nose lifted and pulled, a silent insistence. Then the world lurched. A sharp electronic chirp stabbed through the music. Another joined it. Then another, higher, panicked, multiplying. A nearby parked SUV erupted into a wailing car alarm. A row of vehicles followed like dominoes, horns bleating, lights flashing. Across the street, the donation buildings, security sirens screamed to life, a harsh oscillating howl that made heads whip around and hands fly to ears. And from somewhere inside that brick building came the unmistakable pulse of a fire panel. Beep, 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 urgent, rhythmic, wrong. For a half second, the crowd froze in a single shared confusion, faces lit by red and blue reflections and Christmas bulbs, mouths open as if the town itself had just shouted. Parents pulled children close. Volunteers stared at each other, unsure whether to run or laugh it off. Someone yelled, "False alarm," like saying it could make it true. The handler didn't move like a man guessing. He moved like a man who'd heard this kind of chaos before and knew chaos was never just noise. It was cover. The dog rose without being told, muscles tight under his coat, and let out one low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, more like a warning drawn straight from training. The little girl flinched, then grabbed the handler's sleeve with both hands, as if he was the only solid thing in a street that had suddenly turned unreal. "It's happening," she whispered, voice cracking. They said when the alarms start, you won't know who to trust. And as the handler's eyes locked on that donation building, he felt the shape of the title in his bones. Little girl whispers a secret to her police dog. Seconds later, alarms go off everywhere. Because right then, with sirens clawing at the winter air and the crowd starting to surge, he understood one brutal truth. This wasn't a malfunction. This was a message. Earlier that day, the town had looked like it was trying to convince itself nothing bad could ever happen there. The kind of place where winter meant twinkle lights instead of warnings. Where the cold air smelled like pine and cinnamon instead of smoke. Morning sun poured over the rooftops in pale gold, catching on frosted window panes and the thin skin of ice along the curb. And everywhere you looked, there were people preparing for the festival with the easy confidence of folks who believed their traditions were a shield. Volunteers stringing lights between lampposts, teens hauling boxes of ornaments out of a community van. A vendor setting up a cocoa station that sent up sweet steam as soon as the first pot warmed. Holiday music drifted from tinny speakers on the gazebo, testing volume, skipping a beat, starting again. And the town's main street slowly transformed from ordinary to staged, like a set being dressed for a feel-good movie. That's when the veteran handler arrived, not with a siren or a show, but with a quiet patrol SUV that rolled in like it belonged to the scenery. He parked where he could see the whole block. Entrances, alley mouths, the donation building across the street, the narrow service lane behind the shops. And for a moment he just sat, hand on the steering wheel, letting his eyes sweep the town the way a storm watcher scans clouds. He'd been in places where people didn't decorate for winter, where the only lights were flares and muzzle flashes. And he carried that history in the way he moved, calm, measured, never wasting a step. Beside him in the back was his K9 partner, posture relaxed but alert. A working dog with a friendly face and serious eyes. The kind that could accept a child's gentle touch 1 second and lock onto a threat the next without hesitation. The handler opened the rear door, and the dog hopped out cleanly, landing on the pavement like he'd been poured from discipline. Tail low but not tucked, ears mapping every sound. The scrape of a ladder, the clink of metal poles, the distant laugh of someone behind a storefront. The handler clipped the leash to the harness with the same steady hands that had done it 1,000 times, then spoke softly, not like a command barked for an audience, more like a reminder between partners. The dog responded with a small glance up, then immediately returned his attention to the street. They started walking, not rushed, but purposeful, moving into the festival space before it was fully alive. When the people were still arranging tables and stacking donation bins and hanging wreaths. And the dog was calm, yes, polite even, letting a volunteer crouch and say hello, letting a child wave from a distance, accepting the soft attention the way a professional accepts small talk, briefly, without letting it blur the mission. His nose worked constantly, drawing invisible maps through cold air, the smell of hot chocolate powder, the faint petroleum tang from a generator, the sharp sting of fresh paint on a sign, the sweaty wool scent of someone who'd been carrying boxes too long. His eyes flicked to hands, always hands, then to bags, then to the dark gaps between buildings where trouble liked to hide. The handler noticed the small things too. Which doors were propped open, which windows had blinds twitching, which men lingered without purpose near the donation building as if waiting for something rather than helping. He didn't announce his thoughts. He filed them away. That was what made him different from the local officers who sometimes treated events like this as easy overtime. He understood that crowds made people careless, and careless was where predators lived. At the gazebo, the event coordinator hustled up with a clipboard and bright holiday energy, thanking him for being there, joking about how the biggest danger would be too much sugar. The handler gave her a small nod and a half smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, because he'd heard that kind of joke in other places right before everything changed. "We'll keep it smooth," he said, voice low, steady, reassuring without promising more than he could deliver. His dog stood at his left, like a shadow with a heartbeat, scanning the flow of volunteers as they moved between tables, tracking the street as more cars arrived, listening to the town waking up. Sleigh display was being positioned near the photo area, and someone dragged a plastic reindeer across the pavement with a squeak that made a few people laugh. The dog didn't laugh. He didn't flinch either. He simply adjusted his stance to keep the handler between the crowd and the narrow service alley, a living early warning system disguised as a beloved community guest. The handler watched the donation building again, brick, bannered, cheerful, and felt a faint prickle at the base of his neck, the kind of instinct you don't earn in safe towns. He had no proof yet, no incident to point to, just a sense that the air carried something under the cinnamon and pine. He tightened his grip on the leash by a fraction, and the dog glanced up as if to say, "I feel it too." Then the handler turned his gaze back to the street and kept walking. Quiet competence in motion, because the day was still calm, still bright, still pretending. And he knew calm was exactly when you had to be ready. For the moment, it broke. She was there from the beginning, though almost no one noticed her at first, because towns like this are practiced at overlooking quiet children, especially during celebrations when noise is treated like proof of happiness. The little girl hovered near the edge of the festival space, boots scuffed, mittens a size too big, posture careful in a way that didn't belong to someone her age. She said, "Excuse me," when she passed adults, said thank you even when no one had done her a favor, and held herself with a politeness that felt rehearsed, as if she'd learned early that good manners were armor. But what gave her away, what marked her as different, was her eyes. They didn't wander the way children's eyes usually do, chasing lights and colors and movement for fun. They tracked. They measured. They moved from face to face, lingering just long enough to read moods, to check hands, to note who was watching whom. When a man laughed too loudly, her shoulders stiffened. When someone raised their voice across the street, even in cheer, she flinched before she caught herself. She stood near a cocoa stand for a while, pretending to study the menu. But her attention kept sliding back to the police dog like a compass needle pulled by something steady and true. There was relief in her gaze when she looked at him. Real relief, the kind you see when someone spots a lighthouse through fog. She edged closer once, slow and careful, fingers worrying the edge of her sleeve, eyes flicking to the handler and then back to the dog as if asking permission without words. The dog noticed her immediately, head angling just enough to acknowledge her presence, tail giving a small, controlled sweep that wasn't play, but wasn't threat either. It was an invitation wrapped in discipline. The handler clocked her too, not with suspicion, but with that quiet attention he gave anyone who didn't quite fit the rhythm of the crowd. The girl took another step, and then she froze. Across the street, near the donation building, a man in a pressed coat and polished shoes turned his head and smiled. It was a practiced smile, wit and friendly, the kind meant to reassure onlookers and dominate children at the same time. His eyes didn't smile. They pinned. The girl's bravery cracked just enough to show what lived underneath. Fear sharpened by familiarity. She stepped back at once, shoulders curling inward, gaze dropping to the ground like she'd been caught doing something wrong. The man's smile lingered. Then he nodded to someone beside him, a larger figure with a stance that blocked rather than blended, and returned to his conversation as if nothing had happened. The girl drifted away, pretending sudden interest in a display of ornaments, hands shaking just enough that one slipped from its hook and clinked softly against the table. She murmured an apology, cheeks flushing, and fixed it with meticulous care before backing away again. From a distance, she watched the dog, hope and fear warring in her expression. She tried a different angle, circling through the crowd, timing her approach with bursts of laughter and music, inching closer whenever the handler turned his attention elsewhere. Each time she felt herself getting within arm's reach of the dog, that same man's presence cut across her like a shadow. Sometimes it was just the tilt of his head. Sometimes it was a hand settling on the shoulder of another adult nearby, casual but claiming space. Once, he said her name, not loudly, not angrily, just enough to remind her he knew it, and the sound of it made her stop dead. "I'm just looking," she replied automatically, the words falling out of her mouth like a line she'd practiced. "Of course you are," he said with that same pleasant smile. And for anyone watching, it would have looked like kindness. To the girl, it was a leash. She retreated again, heart hammering, and leaned against a high lamppost as if she needed the cold metal to keep herself upright. The handler saw that exchange this time, not the words, but the effect, and felt something tighten in his chest. The dog's ears flicked, attention narrowing, eyes following the girl as she moved away. The handler knelt briefly to adjust the harness, using the moment to bring his face closer to the dog's ear, murmuring nothing at all, just breathing steady, letting the dog read the tension in his body. Across the street, the important man laughed, loud and warm, clapping someone on the back as if he owned the space. The crowd flowed around him without question. The girl stood very still, gathering herself, courage rebuilding in small, stubborn increments. She looked at the dog again, and this time there was decision in her eyes, fragile but unyielding, because whatever she was carrying was heavier than her fear, and she knew, somehow, that the only way to put it down was to get close to the one creature in the square who wouldn't lie, wouldn't smile to hide teeth, and wouldn't look away. The moment snapped into place the way a trap closes, quiet at first, almost invisible, and then suddenly undeniable, because the girl's courage finally pushed her to move again. And the town's cheerful mask didn't know what to do with a child who refused to stay in her assigned corner. She slipped between two families taking photos by the sleigh, ducked around a volunteer carrying a tray of cookies, and made a straight line for the police dog with the kind of determination that only shows up when someone has been frightened for too long and decides fear is no longer the boss. The handler saw her coming and softened his posture, lowering his center slightly, ready to guide her safely into reach without breaking the dog's working focus. The dog turned his head and watched her approach, calm and receptive, tail giving that controlled, steady sweep. For a split second, it looked like the simplest thing in the world, a child seeking comfort beside a trusted animal. Then a voice cut through the music, pleasant in tone, sharp in purpose. "Sweetheart." Heads turned at the word, because it sounded like care. The girl stopped mid-step as if she'd hit an invisible wall. The important man stepped into the open like he belonged there, coat immaculate, hair neat, smile bright enough for a campaign poster. Beside him lumbered his enforcer, a broad man with a heavy jaw and a too loud laugh, the kind who enjoyed taking up space. The important man's smile stayed in place, while his eyes narrowed just a fraction, and he spoke as if addressing a silly little misunderstanding. "You can't just wander off like that," he said, voice warm, almost teasing. "You're going to scare people." The girl's fingers curled into fists inside her mittens. "I wasn't," she began, then swallowed the rest of the sentence like it was dangerous. The man sighed in a theatrical way, the performance aimed at the bystanders. We've talked about this, he continued, shaking his head like a patient guardian forced to deal with a stubborn child. You need to stay where you're supposed to be. This is a big event. Lots of strangers. His emphasis on strangers landed like a warning disguised as a lesson. The enforcer chuckled, a loud, ugly sound. Yeah, he added, speaking to no one and everyone. Little Miss Explorer's got a habit. Don't you? The girl's face went pale under the rosy festival lights. She glanced at the handler once, quick, pleading, then dropped her eyes to the ground. Her shoulders folded inward, not like shame, but like someone trying to become smaller than the danger. A few adults nearby shifted uncomfortably. One woman tightened her grip on her toddler's hand. A volunteer with a name tag opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, eyes darting toward the man's polished shoes, his confident stance, the way other officials nodded at him from across the street. The town knew him. The town deferred to him. That's what made it worse. The important man stepped closer to the girl, still smiling, and gently, too gently, took her elbow between two fingers as if she were a thing he could reposition. Come on, he said, voice still sweet. Let's get you back. You're making a scene. The words were velvet. The intent was steel. The enforcer loomed on the other side, blocking her path toward the dog, and the crowd around them did what crowds do when power shows its teeth. They pretended they couldn't see. People stared at their phones. Someone suddenly needed more napkins. A man who'd been laughing moments earlier went silent, gaze fixed on the ground. The handler felt the air change, that familiar pressure that came when intimidation was being used as a tool instead of an accident. He'd seen it in different uniforms, different languages, different streets, but the mechanics were always the same. A predator cloaked in legitimacy, a victim trained to comply, a community trained to look away. The dog sensed it too. Ears forward, body still, gaze locked not on the man's smile but on his hands. The handler took a step, not rushing, not making a show, just placing himself a little closer, his voice low and even. Sir, he said, calm as cold water. Is she okay? The important man's smile widened, and for a second it looked like gratitude. Officer, of course, he replied. She's fine, just gets distracted. You know how kids are. He turned that smile toward the bystanders, inviting them to agree, to normalize what they were watching. A few people nodded reflexively, relieved to have permission to believe it was harmless. The handler didn't nod. He watched the girl's face, the tight jaw, the trembling breath, the way her eyes flitted to exits like she was calculating whether she could run. He watched the man's grip, light but unyielding. He watched the enforcer's stance, angled to block, to corral, to isolate. This wasn't a parent correcting a child. This was a handler controlling a witness. The handler felt his own pulse slow, the way it always did when the situation turned from social to tactical. What's her name? He asked, voice still polite, but with a precision that changed the temperature. The important man blinked once, a tiny flicker of irritation before the smile returned. He answered smoothly, too smoothly, like he'd rehearsed being questioned. The girl didn't speak. She couldn't. Her throat worked like she wanted to, but fear had its hands around her voice. The handler held the man's gaze and saw, beneath the festive friendliness, a calculation that didn't belong in a holiday square. The dog shifted half a step closer to the handler's leg, protective without escalating, a living barrier. The important man's fingers tightened on the girl's elbow, just enough for her to flinch, and the handler knew, with cold certainty, that whatever was happening here had been happening for a while. The scolding wasn't discipline. It was a public reminder. I can touch you, I can move you, and everyone will call it normal. And as the crowd stayed frozen in polite discomfort, the handler made a decision he didn't announce. He simply adjusted his grip on the leash, squared his shoulders between the girl and the men, and prepared for the moment the town would be forced to see what it had been trained to ignore. The girl didn't fight him. Not the way people imagine fighting, with shouting and flailing. Because children who live under control learn a quieter kind of resistance. Timing, patience, and the courage to move 1 inch when the world isn't looking. The important man guided her away from the dog with that pleasant, practiced firmness, still smiling at the bystanders as if he'd just corrected a harmless misbehavior, and the crowd exhaled in relief, grateful to return to Coco and Carol's instead of conflict. But the veteran handler didn't exhale. He watched the girl's feet, the way they dragged for half a step and then caught themselves. The way her head turned slightly back toward the dog like a compass trying to find north. The handler let them go, on purpose. Because sometimes the safest move is to pretend you're not watching while you watch harder than ever. He and the dog continued their slow patrol line along the festival perimeter, appearing casual, appearing like part of the holiday security theater, while his mind built a map. The donation building across the street, the service lane behind it, the temporary generator near the gazebo, the single narrow corridor between the brick wall and a line of vendor tents. The dog remained calm to the untrained eye. But the handler felt the subtle shift in his partner's attention, the way his ears kept flicking toward that man's voice, the way his eyes tracked the enforcer's boots with a quiet, professional dislike. Then the moment arrived, the way moments like this always do. Fast, imperfect, and born from necessity. A volunteer dropped a box of plastic ornaments near the sleigh display, and the ornaments scattered across the pavement with a clattering burst that sent people bending down at once, laughing, reaching, blocking sight lines. Kids darted in, squealing. Adults stepped aside, creating a brief, accidental corridor in the crowd. The important man turned his head to respond to someone calling his name. Another official, another smile exchange. And his grip on the girl's elbow loosened just a fraction. That fraction was everything. The girl slipped free like a fish through a net, not running. Running would trigger the enforcer's chase instinct. But moving quickly, purposefully, weaving through the bending bodies with practiced stealth. The handler saw her before anyone else did, and the dog saw her too, head lifting, attention snapping to her path. She cut behind the cocoa stand where steam fogged the air, ducked under a string of lights, and appeared beside the dog, as if the crowd had blinked and she'd teleported. Her hands landed on the dog's harness for balance, not grabbing, just anchoring herself to something steady. And she leaned in so close her mouth brushed the fur near his ear. Her whisper came out in broken pieces, forced through fear like air through a cracked door. "It's in the donation building," she breathed. "Not the front. The back, behind the mop closet. There's a metal panel. They said it's timed." Her voice shook on the word timed, like she could taste what it meant. "They said, when the music starts, when everyone's here, it'll go off and nobody will know why. They said it will look like an accident." She swallowed hard, and the next words came smaller, heavier. "They said if I tell, my mom disappears." The dog changed in an instant. The transformation so clean, it felt like watching a switch flip from friendly presence to precision instrument. First, absolute stillness. His muscles locked, his tail stopped, his breathing quieted. Then his nose began to work. Fast, shallow draws as he pulled scent from cold air and steam and human bodies, sorting it all like a machine sorting signals from noise. His eyes narrowed toward the street, toward the brick building with the cheerful banner, and his body angled without being told, weight shifting forward. The handler's expression didn't change much, but his voice dropped into something deeper and colder, the tone that lived beneath politeness. "Hey," he murmured to the girl, soft enough that only she and the dog could hear. "Look at me." She did, eyes wide and wet. "You did the right thing," he said, each word deliberate, a hand briefly touching her shoulder. Not ownership, not control, but reassurance. Then his gaze flicked up, scanning over the crowd, finding the important man's smile searching, hunting. The dog gave one short, contained huff, a working alert, and leaned into the leash with a focused pull toward the narrow gap between vendor tents, the service corridor that ran behind the donation building like a hidden vein. The handler didn't yank back. He didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip, adjusted his stance to place his body between the girl and the direction the enforcer would come from, and spoke into his radio with calm, clipped certainty, the holiday cheer draining out of his words. "Unit on foot," he said, eyes locked on the service lane. "Possible time device reported. Moving to service corridor but behind donation building now." The girl's fingers clung to the dog's harness like she was afraid the truth would slip away if she let go. And the dog pulled again, harder this time, nose forward, ears sharp, leading them toward the back of the building, toward whatever had been hidden, whatever had been planned, and whatever, according to a terrified child, was already counting down. The service corridor behind the vendor tents was narrow and half dark, lit only by the spill of holiday bulbs and a weak winter sun that couldn't quite reach the gap between brick and canvas. And the moment the handler stepped into it, the noise of the festival dulled, as if the town itself had been muffled. The dog's paws moved with quiet urgency, nails clicking once on the frozen pavement before his gait smoothed into that controlled pull that meant purpose. And the handler followed without hesitation, one hand firm on the leash, the other hovering near his radio as his eyes swept for tripwires, for fresh footprints, for anything out of place. The girl stayed close behind his hip, tiny steps trying to match adult pace, breath coming fast, and the handler's body angled instinctively to shield her from the open end of the corridor where anyone could appear. Halfway down, the air changed, metallic, faintly chemical under the cinnamon from the street. And the dog's nose snapped lower, working faster, head sweeping left to right like he was painting an invisible line across the brick. Then the first alarm hit, a sharp electronic chirp from somewhere near the main street. It wasn't loud enough to panic anyone yet, just a beep that made a few heads turn. A second chirp answered it, and then a third. The dog paused for one fraction of a second, ears twitching, and the handler felt his stomach drop because the pattern wasn't sloppy. It was sequenced. Out on the street, a car alarm suddenly erupted into full wail. Then another joined it, then another, like a domino run you couldn't stop once it started. The festival's music was swallowed by sirens. People laughed at first, nervous, disbelieving laughs. Because in a small town, you want malfunctions to be funny. You want chaos to be harmless. Someone shouted, "Who's messing with the alarms?" And a few teenagers grinned like they'd been accused of a prank they didn't commit. But the alarms didn't stop. They multiplied. A security siren from the donation building shrieked to life with a raw, urgent pitch. And almost immediately the fire panel inside began its pulsing warning. Beep, beep, beep. Loud enough now to reach the corridor and vibrate in the handler's teeth. The crowd's laughter fractured into confusion, then fear. The handler heard the shift the way a veteran hears it. The pitch of voices rising, the sudden stamp of feet, the way people's movements turn jerky when they don't know where the danger is. "False alarm," someone tried again, louder. But the words sounded thin against the layered sirens. The dog pulled harder, dragging the handler deeper toward the back of the donation building where the corridor widened into a small service alcove. Trash bins, a salt bucket, a mop leaning against a wall. And there, half hidden behind, stacked cardboard and a sagging tarp, was a metal utility access panel set low into the brick. Its screws too new, its edges too clean. The dog stopped dead in front of it and went rigid, nose hovering inches away, breath short and fast. He didn't bark, didn't lunge, just stared and indicated with his body the way trained dogs do when they're sure. The handler crouched without touching anything, eyes narrowing, and saw it. A hair-thin wire peeking from the panel's seam, the kind that shouldn't be there, the kind that didn't belong in a donation drive. His voice dropped into ice. "Back," he told the girl, and she stumbled away, eyes huge, hands over her mouth to keep from making sound. The handler keyed his radio again, controlled and precise. "Confirmed indication at utility panel. Possible device. Establish perimeter. Evacuate front, now." Out on the street, the panic finally caught up to the sound. People began to move in waves, parents scooping children, volunteers abandoning tables, bodies surging toward open space. And right then, at the mouth of the corridor, the important man appeared with his polished coat and his bright, too easy smile, clapping his hands as if he could turn sirens into a joke. All right," he called, laughing loudly over the alarms, voice pitched for an audience. "Everybody relax. These old systems trip all the time. It's the cold. Happens every year." The enforcer stood half a step behind him, scanning the corridor with a predatory calm. The handler looked at the important man's face and felt something settle into place with sick clarity. The man's eyes weren't wide with surprise. His breath wasn't caught in confusion. His posture wasn't startled by chaos. He was performing reassurance, selling normalcy, shaping the crowd's interpretation in real time. He wasn't reacting to the alarms. He was using them. And as the dog held his rigid alert at the panel like a silent accusation, the handler realized the fatal mistake wasn't just that a timed trap had been planted in a public place. It was that the man who was supposed to be shocked by it wasn't. The handler hadn't even finished the last word into his radio when another figure shouldered into the corridor as if authority itself had decided to show up and smother the truth before it could breathe. He was local. Everyone knew him by face, if not by name. A mid-level official with a badge clipped to a belt that had never seen a field scuffle, hair combed too neatly for winter wind. The kind of man who spoke in calm, reasonable tones while doing unreasonable things. He raised both palms toward the handler like he was calming a dog, not a fellow officer. Hey, he said, forcing a chuckle, eyes darting from the K9's rigid indication to the metal utility panel and then to the important man hovering at the corridor mouth. "Let's not make this bigger than it is. These alarms are old. The festival brings in donations, families, tourists. We can't have a scene." Behind him, the important man kept smiling for invisible cameras, nodding along as if the official was speaking common sense. The enforcer's gaze stayed flat and hungry. The handler remained crouched near the panel, careful not to touch anything, but his shoulders squared as he rose, the K9 pressed to his left like a living shield. "My dog's indicating a concealed access panel with an exposed wire," the handler said, voice low and controlled. "I need space. I need evac. I need bomb tech." The official's smile thinned. "Bomb tech?" he repeated, like the phrase itself was an insult. "Listen, you're a good officer, but you're spooking people. We're in the middle of a community event. We're not shutting down Main Street because a dog sat down near a wall." The handler watched the official's eyes, not on the panel, not on the girl, but on the important man, seeking approval. That was the tell. The girl stood a few steps back, half hidden behind a trash bin, trembling so hard her breath made little clouds of panic. She looked like she wanted to speak, like words were clawing at her throat. But every time she glanced toward the important man, her courage flinched. "Tell him," the handler murmured without turning fully, keeping his body angled to block the corridor mouth. "Just the facts. You're safe right here." The girl's lips parted. "It's," she began, voice tiny. The official snapped his head toward her, and the friendly mask slipped for a heartbeat. "Who's that?" he demanded, and the important man answered smoothly, before the child could. "Just a confused kid," he said lightly. "She's been wandering all morning. We've got it handled." The handler felt heat rise in his chest, controlled fury held behind discipline. "She's a witness," he said. And the dog, as if punctuating the word, gave one low, contained warning, sound from deep in his chest, not aggressive, but unmistakably serious. The official flinched and then tried to turn the flinch into irritation. "Keep that dog under control," he snapped. "I'm ordering you to stand down. Step away from the building. We'll reset the alarms, get maintenance to check the panel, and we move on. We are not ruining this festival." The handler's gaze slid past the official to the donation building's back corner, where a maintenance door sat recessed in brick. It should have been a standard service entrance, unremarkable, probably propped open during event setup. But it was shut tight, and on the outside was a fresh padlock that looked newer than everything around it. A door that shouldn't be locked during a donation drive. A door that screamed, "Keep out." The handler's mind stacked the evidence. The K9's alert at a tampered utility panel, the timed warning from the child, the staged reassurance from the important man, and now the locked door, an obstacle meant to delay anyone who might stumble onto the truth. The official took a step closer, lowering his voice like he was being reasonable. "You're out of your lane," he said. "You want to help? Help calm the crowd. Let us handle the rest." It wasn't an offer. It was containment. The handler recognized it instantly. Institutional resistance wearing a polite face, a system trying to bury an incident by declaring it inconvenient. Out on Main Street, the sirens still wailed, and the crowd's movement had become frantic. People pushing toward open spaces, parents shouting names, volunteers crying because they didn't know what to do with their hands. The handler knew the most dangerous moment in any panic was when the wrong person controlled the narrative. And right now, that narrative was being shaped by smiles and orders and the word overreaction. He made his decision without flinching. "Copy," he said aloud to the official, giving just enough compliance to keep the man from escalating physically. But his thumb pressed his radio's discreet emergency channel, and his voice, barely above a breath, dropped into a code that didn't ask permission. "Requesting outside response," he transmitted quietly, eyes never leaving the locked door in the panel. "Possible explosive device. Possible corruption on scene. Need supervisor and specialized unit. Now." Then he shifted his stance so his body was a wall, between the girl and the corridor mouth, between the truth and the people trying to smother it. The dog stayed pressed to his leg, still alert, still silent, still deadly serious. The official didn't yet realize what the handler had done. But the important man's smile tightened, and the enforcer's shoulders rolled forward like a threat waking up. And as the handler kept his hand steady on the leash and his eyes steady on the locked door, the scene ended on a knife edge. Higher-level support was coming, but The people who wanted this buried were already moving to stop it. While the festival churned into confusion and sirens ate the winter air, the real conversation was happening where the music couldn't reach. Behind a door with frosted glass, above the street where people still believed power was earned instead of taken. The private office smelled like expensive coffee and polished wood. A place curated to look civic and safe. Framed certificates on the wall, a town seal, a photo of smiling officials cutting a ribbon with oversized scissors. But the mood inside was neither civic nor safe. It was tight, clipped, and angry. A man in a tailored coat, older than the important one on the street, but with the same practiced confidence, stood at the window watching the flashing lights reflect off the snow. "This was not the schedule," he hissed, knuckles whitening as he gripped the window frame. Across from him, another figure sat behind a desk as if sitting could make him untouchable, fingers tapping a pen in a rhythm that betrayed his nerves. A third man, heavy-set and red-faced, paced near a filing cabinet, phone pressed to his ear, whispering into it like the walls were listening. "They're panicking down there," he said, then pulled the phone away and spat the next words into the room. "Your boy was supposed to keep it friendly. False alarm, old system, cold weather. That's what you promised." The man at the window turned, eyes sharp. "He is keeping it friendly," he snapped. "That K9 handler is the problem. The veteran." The word veteran came out like an insult and a fear at the same time. The one behind the desk leaned forward, lowering his voice as if volume could summon consequences. "We needed a clean distraction," he said. "Not a scandal, not an evacuation. We need that transfer done before sundown. Once it's moved, no one can stop the development vote. No one can stop the deal." He slid a folder across the desk, thin, deceptively ordinary. On the cover, a bland label. Property acquisition. Inside, it wasn't just paper. It was leverage. Stamped approvals, signatures, and a sealed chain of custody document for something that shouldn't have been in a town hall office at all. Evidence. Money. Both, in different ways, were poison. "The donation building is a perfect cover," the red-faced man insisted, pacing harder. "Boxes in and out all day, volunteers everywhere. No one questions a truck backing up to the service lane. By the time anyone notices, what's inside those sealed containers is already gone." The man at the window slammed his palm against the glass. "And now," he growled, "we've got that dog pointing at the panel, like it's the hand of God." The one behind the desk rubbed his forehead. The device was never supposed to be found. It wasn't even supposed to trigger half the alarms. It's a chain reaction. One sensor trips another. Then the whole street lights up. Confusion buys us minutes. Minutes buy us distance. He looked up, eyes cold. "If we lose minutes, we lose everything." The heavy man stopped pacing long enough to stab a finger toward the window. "Then stop it," he barked. "You told me local authority would keep him in line." The desk man's mouth tightened. "Local authority's trying," he said, "but he's calling for outside units. If a supervisor shows up and asks the wrong questions, we don't just lose a deal. We lose freedom." Silence fell, thick and ugly. And then the open loop, the piece that didn't fit, rose like a bad smell. "The girl," the window man said suddenly, quieter now, more dangerous. "How does she know about the timing?" The others glanced at each other, a flicker of annoyance. The heavy man scoffed. "She's a kid. She hears things. She repeats them. Who cares?" "I care," the desk man snapped, voice sharp enough to cut. "Because she shouldn't have been anywhere near that plan. We kept the inner room tight. We kept trucks off the street until the trigger. We kept our hands clean. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. So, either someone talked, or she saw something she wasn't supposed to see. The window man's gaze drifted to the framed ribbon-cutting photo, the smiling faces frozen in civic pride, and his expression hardened. "And why?" he asked, each word slow. Was she allowed to stay close? If she was a risk, she should have been removed days ago. The heavy man shifted uncomfortably. "The mother," he muttered. "She's useful. Keeps the kid quiet." The desk man's pen tapping stopped. "Useful," he echoed, disgusted. "So we gambled with a witness because we wanted leverage over her family." He exhaled through his nose. And now that witness is whispering to a police dog. The window man turned back to the street where sirens flashed like warnings from the sky. "Fix it," he said, voice low and final. "Contain the handler. Contain the child. The town is not the target. This town is a stage. The real target is what moves tonight. If the veteran K9 handler stops that transfer, the first domino doesn't fall." He paused, eyes narrowing as if he could see the whole chain reaction ahead. The whole wall collapses. The heavy man's phone buzzed again. He answered, listened, and went pale. "He's still in the corridor," he whispered, "and the dog won't leave the panel." The desk man rose slowly, straightening his jacket like he was dressing for war. "Then we switch plans," he said. "We stop treating this like a festival problem." His gaze lifted, cold and calculating. "We treat it like a witness problem." And as the office door clicked shut behind them, the question hung in the stale air like a ghost that refused to be ignored. How did a gentle little girl learn enough to trigger a town's alarms? And why had the people in power ever believed she would stay silent forever? Chaos is a curtain, and predators love to work behind it. Out on Main Street, the sirens had turned the festival into a shaking kaleidoscope of flashing lights and frantic bodies. Parents calling names, volunteers trying to herd people away from the donation building, kids crying because the world had suddenly become too loud. In the corridor, the handler held his position like an anchor in a rip current, body angled between the girl and the mouth of the service lane, his K9 still locked on the utility panel with a rigid, unmistakable alert. The compromised official was still there, now talking too fast into his own radio, trying to sound in control while his eyes kept flicking toward the important man, as if waiting for instructions. And the important man, still smiling, was moving, not toward the crowd to help, but toward the child. He didn't step into the corridor himself. That would look bad. Instead, he made a small motion with his fingers. The enforcer responded immediately, slipping through the gap like a boulder with a mission, shoulders filling the narrow space, blocking daylight. "Come on, kid," the enforcer said, voice pitched low, almost gentle if you didn't know how to listen. "We're gonna get you out of the way. You're not supposed to be back here." He reached for her wrist with casual ownership, like it was a simple correction. The girl stiffened, terror flashing across her face. She glanced at the handler, one desperate look. And then her eyes darted to the crowd beyond the corridor as if she hoped someone might notice. But nobody was looking here. Everybody was looking at the flashing lights, at the screaming alarms, at anything except the quiet violence happening in the shadows. The handler moved without theatrics, one smooth step that placed his body between the enforcer's hand and the girl. "Don't touch her," he said, voice calm enough to sound polite, cold enough to be a warning. The enforcer's mouth twisted into a grin. "Officer, I'm helping," he said, loud enough that if anyone overheard, it would sound reasonable. "She's in danger back here." His hand darted again, faster this time, aiming to grab and pull. The canine moved first. Not with a bark, not with a lunge, just a precise shift. Shoulders squared, head lifted, body inserted into the space like a door sliding shut. The dog's eyes locked on the enforcer's hand, and a low growl rolled out. Controlled, professional. The kind that says one more inch, and you lose the right to pretend this is friendly. The enforcer froze, smile faltering as he realized the dog wasn't a decoration. He wasn't even a pet. He was a trained boundary with teeth. The handler used that split second to hook his arm around the girl's shoulders and guide her backward, away from the corridor mouth, toward the alcove where the bins and salt bucket could hide them from casual eyes. "Stay behind me," he murmured, steady as a metronome, and the girl obeyed, hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of his jacket like it was the only stable thing left in the world. The enforcer's grin returned, forced now. "That dog's gonna bite me," he taunted, raising his hands in mock innocence for any unseen witness. The compromised official cleared his throat, anxious. Okay, everyone calm down," he said, trying to reclaim control. "Officer, you're escalating." But the handler didn't look at him. He was watching the important man who stood just beyond the corridor, still smiling, eyes sharp, calculating angles. That smile tightened when he saw the canine block the grab. Tightened again when he saw the handler's stance. Then, from deeper in the service lane, where the donation building's locked maintenance door sat like a secret, someone stumbled into view. A young man. Not one of the festival volunteers, not one of the town's big smiles. He wore a maintenance jacket with a patch that looked newly sewn, and his face was pale, eyes wide like he'd just realized he'd been standing on a trap door. He held something in his hand, wrapped in a rag, shaking so hard the rag fluttered. "Officer," he panted, voice thin, breaking. I can prove it." The compromised official started toward him, sharp. "Who are you? Get back." The young man flinched, then pushed past the official's shoulder as if fear had finally turned into momentum. He held out the rag. Inside was a small plastic casing, scuffed, cracked on one edge, with a tiny circuit board still seated inside. The kind of device that could piggyback alarms, the kind of device that could trigger a chain reaction. "I saw them install it," the young man whispered, breath fogging. "They said it was just a test. But it wasn't a test. I pulled this out when the alarm started. This is from the panel." His other hand dug into his pocket and produced a key card, plain white plastic with a magnetic strip, along with a folded printout, the paper damp from sweat. "Access logs," he blurted, shoving it forward. "Entry times, door opens, door closes. The padlock wasn't there yesterday. It's there today because they moved something inside. I copied the card when they weren't looking. Please, you have to take it." The handler's eyes flicked over the proof, mind snapping pieces together. The casing, the logs, the locked door. The important man's smile had vanished now, replaced by a stare as flat as ice. The enforcer shifted, weighing whether to grab the insider, whether to grab the girl, whether to grab both. The dog's growl deepened by a fraction, not louder, just darker. The young man swallowed hard, then leaned in toward the handler like he was confessing into a storm. "I shouldn't be here," he whispered. "I shouldn't even be talking to you. But that kid, I heard her crying earlier, and I can't do this anymore." His eyes darted toward the mouth of the lane, toward the street where sirens still screamed. "They think everyone's distracted," he said, voice shaking harder now. "They think no one will notice." He grabbed the handler's sleeve, fingers tight with panic. And the next words came out like a warning bell. "They're coming back," he breathed. "Right now." The words "right now" hadn't even finished echoing in the narrow service lane when the sound of authority finally changed. No longer the chaotic scream of alarms, but the clean, deliberate bite of tires on cold pavement and the clipped bark of radios speaking in codes that didn't belong to local politics. A pair of unmarked SUVs rolled in hard at the far end of the street, lights cutting through snowfall in tight, disciplined pulses, followed by a marked unit whose presence alone altered the crowd's behavior. People stopped guessing and started obeying, stepping back, clearing space, faces paling as they realized this wasn't a harmless malfunction anymore. The compromised official tried to move first, stepping into the corridor mouth with his hands up, ready to explain, ready to steer the story back into something manageable. But a stern voice met him before he could take control. "Step aside," a supervisor from outside the town line ordered, arriving with two officers who didn't look impressed by festival banners or friendly smiles. The veteran handler didn't posture. He didn't argue. He did what competence always does when the right people arrive. He handed over the truth cleanly. He held the copied access card by its edges like evidence, passed the printed logs with a brief summary, timestamps, entries, the locked maintenance door that shouldn't have been locked, and presented the device casing wrapped in the rag without contaminating it. His words short, procedural, and impossible to spin. "K99 indicated on utility panel," he said. "Child witness reported timing. Insider provided logs and casing. Maintenance door padlocked recently. Possible device or tampering inside." The K9 remained planted at the panel, still and unwavering, a living arrow pointing at the lie. The outside supervisor's gaze flicked from the dog's alert to the locked door, and then to the important man standing beyond the corridor, still trying to rebuild his smile like a mask slipping off a face. "False alarm," the important man began, laugh too bright, too rehearsed. "These systems—" "Stop," the supervisor cut in, voice flat. "Who are you?" The important man's smile faltered for the first time. Not because he'd been challenged, but because he'd been stripped of the familiar script. He gave his name and title quickly, like credentials or armor. The supervisor didn't flinch. "Then you won't mind stepping back while we secure this scene," he said. And when the important man tried to protest, the supervisor's eyes narrowed. "And you," he added, looking at the enforcer. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The enforcer's jaw flexed, anger flashing. But the K9 shifted half a step, silent, controlled warning written in posture, and the enforcer stopped pretending to be helpful. Two outside officers moved to the locked maintenance door. One photographed the padlock, the other set a tool to it with efficient calm. The snap of the lock breaking sounded small compared to the sirens, but it carried more weight than any alarm. It was the sound of a barrier failing. The door opened a crack and the air inside smelled wrong. Chemical, sharp, and the outside supervisor immediately signaled for specialized personnel. Within minutes, a technician in protective gear was kneeling at the utility panel, confirming what the handler already knew in his bones. This wasn't a glitch, it was a mechanism. The important man watched, eyes darting, and as more outside units arrived, faces the town didn't control, the web began to show itself. The insider's logs matched entries the important man couldn't explain. The casing matched components found behind the panel. A sealed container inside the maintenance area raised questions that made local officials suddenly quiet. One by one, the smiles collapsed. The compromised official's confidence drained into sweat as he realized his minimization had become a recorded decision. The important man's laugh died entirely when an officer calmly turned him around and placed him in restraints. The metallic click of cuffs louder than any holiday music. The enforcer moved as if to object and immediately found himself surrounded, his intimidation evaporating under disciplined numbers. Out on the street, the crowd, still frightened, watched as the first domino fell, then the next, confusion turning into stunned silence. Silence turning into the dawning realization that the alarms hadn't ruined the festival. They'd revealed the rot hiding under it. Hours later, after the scene was secured and the danger removed, the sirens faded and the snow returned to quiet. The festival didn't roar back to life the same way. It resumed softer, gentler, like a town learning how to breathe again without pretending. Volunteers served cocoa with shaking hands that slowly steadied. Kids returned to the sleigh display, cautious at first, then giggling again. And near the edge of the square, wrapped in a warm blanket offered by a kind stranger, the little girl stood with her shoulders no longer curled inward. She wasn't smiling big, not yet, but she was breathing. Real breaths. Full and unguarded, like her lungs were finally allowed to take up space. The police dog sat beside her, as if he'd been designed for that exact moment. Loyal, calm, eyes watchful, but kind. And when she rested her small hand against his fur, she didn't flinch at the sound of distant radios anymore. The handler knelt to her level, keeping his voice low, steady, a quiet shelter in the aftermath. "You did the brave thing," he told her, meeting her eyes without pity, only respect. The girl's lip trembled, and she nodded once, small but certain. The handler glanced at his partner, then back to her. "And brave," he said, the words landing like warmth in winter. "Changes everything."